Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. So I'm Rohini Pande. I'm a professor of economics and the director of the Economic Growth Center. I also, together with Dr. Charity Troyer-Moore, direct the Inclusion Economics at Yale University. Inclusion Economics is a policy-engaged research initiative which seeks to promote inclusive institutions, economies, and societies. So in that context, we're particularly delighted to have Barkha Dutt join us today, who has really on the side of journalism always sought to provide news and information that will help India and I think more broadly South Asia move towards being more inclusive. Before I introduce Barkha, let me start by saying that we couldn't have done it without our co-host, the South Asia Studies Council and the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism. Many thanks to Kasturi and Amar at SASC and Bliss and the Poynter team for their help planning this. Also, a big thank you to Zara, Chris, and Jenna who helped plan this event. So let me now briefly introduce Barkha. I think she probably needs very little introduction to the people in the room. She's one of India's best-known journalists who has reported for the last 25 years from war zones and conflict areas across the world. She's also the founding editor of Mojo Story, a multimedia digital platform, and a columnist for the Washington Post. She's received numerous awards, but among them are the Padma Shri and the Global Leader for Tomorrow from the World Economic Forum. To write her most recent book, To Hell and Back, Humans of COVID, Barkha made multiple path-breaking journeys across India, conducting ground reportage during the pandemic. And on tonight's event, she's going to tell us about this. I should also highlight that today's event actually is a flipped version of a policy dialogue we had in Delhi in July, where researchers talked about their findings about the pandemic, and then Barkha was part of a discussion on it. So today we're going to continue the conversation in a flipped version with Barkha telling us about her journeys through COVID and her reflections on through media in India today. And then after that, Charity will provide some research insights which complement Barkha's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Barkha Dutt.
Thank you very much. You can all hear me? Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you also to all of you who may be part of this conversation but are online. I hope to have it be an interactive conversation. So looking for lots of questions and comments from the floor as well as questions coming in from our audience online. Okay. What I want to say before I start talking about my journey across India is that reporting on COVID really helped me understand many things that I did not understand before I embarked on this journey. It helped me understand my country. It helped me understand how power is both wielded and organized structurally. It helped me understand my role as a journalist, and in fact, in particular, made me re-examine what the place is of media, independent media, not just in crisis, but even at other times. So when I wrote this book, To Hell and Back, The Humans of COVID, above everything else, for me, for all of us who lived through the pandemic, we kept hearing things described in terms of numbers, right? Numbers are important. Numbers help us actually get a very, very empirical sense of what's going on. But we would hear all the time dashboards that would tell us caseload, that would tell us hospitalizations, mortalities, and then later vaccine numbers and how many vaccines had been achieved and how many booster doses and so on. But who were the people behind these numbers? Who were the people who populated the numbers? What were their stories? What were their names? Did we even know their names? And talking about numbers, would all of them even be counted? I think that was at the heart of my sort of journey across India. And what I'm going to do is to give you a sense of what this, in a way, taught me, what I had to unlearn. As some of you might know, I spent 20 plus years in television before I moved to the digital media. Some of you were at lunch today and we were talking about the incredible shifts in India, which mirrors the shifts globally, which is, just to take you through some of that data, there are 650 million active internet users in India. 70% of Indians surveyed say they get their news content today via the internet. The top two sources of news are YouTube and WhatsApp. And there are serious questions today over broken revenue models in television newsrooms, as well as ownership by big business houses that raise questions over how free they really are able to be in their storytelling. So for a combination of reasons, shifting technology, wanting to be my own boss, disillusionment with talk TV shops, which was what the state of broadcast media was, I shifted to forming my own digital platform. And as I had registered Mojo Story, and Mojo means magic, I set out to look for the magic of journalism, which I felt I had forgotten and I wanted to rediscover. 2 months or 3 months later, the pandemic hit. So my platform and my life, literally, for the last 3 years has been consumed by the telling of this story. So, okay, yeah. So let me start with some images that I think really captured, in a way, the unique reality of how COVID unfolded in India. Unique because every country negotiated COVID in its own ways. In every country, COVID exposed fault lines that were unique to that country. And in India, we had, in the first wave, something unfold that we hadn't seen actually since the partition of India, which was the mass exodus and the mass movement of millions of India's poorest citizens or daily wage workers. Now, why did this happen? It happened simply because, like every other country in the world, India decided to lock down. But when we locked down, we also closed public transport in the first wave. So in the first wave, you had no buses, no trains, no airports. You only had trucks, to some degree plying essential supplies, oil, grains, and so on. And that was pretty much it. And what happened was that though the government issued orders saying that workers, the poor workers who live on subsistence wages must be paid, nobody was paid because economic activity had come to a grinding halt. So these were men and women who, if you know, for those of you who might be familiar with Indian cities, think of construction sites where a house is coming up or a factory is coming up. They would live on the site and be given temporary, like a shack to stay in while the house was coming up, or they would work as help in the fields. So they really had no homes where they had migrated to. They would just live in these temporary sort of shelters, they would get daily wages, and suddenly they had no source of income. Secondly, there was an underestimation of the fact that, like you and me, and I think it's easy to forget this 3 years later, but the first wave of COVID felt like the end of the world. You didn't know what was going to happen next. We ran flights to bring some of you back home to India, the Vande Bharat missions, but no transport was actually open for the poorest workers. So they decided, men, women, and children, to start walking home. And these were some of the images that I chronicled as I followed them across India. And what I really found was that women in particular had packed their universes, their entire universe into a little, what in Hindi is called a bori, a sack. And they were just, they didn't know whether they were going to come back. They didn't know if they were ever going to come back. They didn't know if they were going to make it to their destinations. But their entire universe packed into a little sack on their head. Sometimes their infants carried on their shoulders, often with no food, a packet of biscuits if they were lucky, a small bottle of water if they were lucky. This is how they walked. And they walked, as I said, hundreds of kilometers, often without shoes. In the scorching heat, it was still extremely hot in North India as they walked home. To my shock, my erstwhile medium, television, and I am a first generation TV journalist. I'm a child of television. I became a journalist when the airwaves were privatized in India. We only started having private news in India in 1995. So it's not that I sort of was born hating television. I was literally groomed by the medium, shaped by the medium. But to my absolute shock, there was hardly any TV presence with boots on the ground. Television had decided to basically look away from these walking workers and concentrate on expert-driven talk TV, which had its place, but was really not capturing the scale of what was unfolding on sort of the shiny expressways, which at other moments were actually an illustration of how much India's infrastructure story had improved, and so on. And so the story of these daily wage workers was told by independent digital platforms like mine, by regional reporters in the language press, by Hindi newspapers, and by what in my industry are called stringers, which are really not professional journalists, but let's say you live in a village and you have a smartphone, you might decide to take a bunch of pictures of what you see, and then you'll contribute that to, let's say, a big network headquartered somewhere in the city. Television effectively just didn't get out. It didn't get out of the metros, and it sat in the studios. In the meantime, we had this sort of crisis unfold, and in some cases, and this is how I started discovering the kind of structural inequalities that, at least my work, I'd been a war correspondent and then a political journalist, so I'd done very little of this work. And I had never really looked at the issues of structural inequalities through a mainstream media lens, and that is what I started doing here. Now, where I'm sitting right now is actually the premises of a major factory in India's capital, Delhi. And this was one of the more extraordinary things I encountered, because the owners of this factory, as these workers left the cities to go back to their homes in the villages, they decided that they must stop the workers from doing this, right? And what they did was they locked up the workers behind these gates. These were the locked gates as we found them. And we somehow managed to force our way in. And when we went in, we actually found a board. And the board actually listed the 2 hours in the day that these workers were allowed to come out for a cup of tea and a bathroom break. I mean, it was literally like locking up chattel. Like, it was just horrendous, and they were completely tone deaf about it. They actually thought that they were looking after the workers by doing this. And when we walked in, we found all of these desolate, desperate people, and they were like, get us out of here somehow. And when we started filming them, we had guards come in, confiscate our tapes, try to lock us in. Of course, we made a whole lot of noise. I started tweeting the chief minister. We managed to get out of there. But in some ways, this was the beginning of my understanding that till then, there was a media cliche that COVID was the great equalizer. But in fact, COVID was the exact opposite of the great equalizer. Every structural inequity of Indian society, and I'm sure this was true globally, but I can only speak to India because that's what I reported on, whether it was class, whether it was caste, whether it was gender, it was exacerbated. It was deepened. It was, that fault line was just wrenched open, and you couldn't look away. And in fact, I remember meeting in Bombay a woman who used to live in the slums, and she used to work as a domestic help in the high-rise skyscrapers all around her. And she said to me, she said, what kind of justice is this? I'll say it in Hindi and then I'll translate it. She said, ये क्या इंसाफ है कि वायरस आया एरोप्लेन पर बैठकर और गरीब आदमी चल रहा है सड़क पर. What kind of justice is this that the virus came into India traveling on an aeroplane, and it's the poor person who's walking on the roads? Yeah? So I think that's what it was. It was while it impacted everybody, the way you experienced the pandemic very much depended on what class you were in, what gender you were, what caste you were, and yes, sometimes what religion you were, because our TV channels not just did not put people on the ground, some of them decided that this was the moment to actually start communalizing the COVID conversation. The reason this happened is one of the earliest mass congregations that took place, that was a super spreader event, there's no doubt about it, was by an Orthodox Muslim sect called the Tablighi Jamaat. And this was just at the cusp of, the restrictions that were then subsequently placed on all mass congregations, except of course election rallies. That's a different debate. This undoubtedly was a congregation that should not have taken place, but once it did, we actually had channels using hashtags like Corona Jihad. This was on a major television channel, the Times Group, and there was another network, the India Today network, which represented the COVID dashboard graphically in skull caps. So they had silhouetted skull caps, and they put their data of what the count of COVID cases that day was in a skull cap, and you can get the reference of that. So one, every inequity was deepened, wrenched open, there for you to see, unless you were wanting to look away. Two, you actually had big media not just look away, but further sort of add to the toxicity around this conversation. So there was either an invisibilization of what was happening to the poor, and in the second wave, a complete invisibilization of rural India, or there was a kind of bigoted lens through which this story was being told. in the meantime, something very odd, in India they say that everything you say and its opposite is true. And we're a very, very paradoxical country. And even on COVID, by the way, one of the big mistakes that India made was to order vaccines very late. But when we finally got to it, because we have a history of mass immunization programs, it's one of our big public health successes, we actually had boats and drones and people walking through jungles deliver vaccines, and we became the second country in the world to cross the 2 billion mark after China in July of the previous year. So what I'm saying is that everything you say about India and its opposite is often true. There has to be a granularity in how we understand my country. And the same thing happened with the police. In this lockdown, the police was first responders. They were among the first responders. So they were vulnerable. They were brave. I met a policeman whose hand was cut off for trying to sort of enforce the lockdown. But on the other hand, the police was also weaponized sometimes against the poorest citizen. So what was happening was that these people would try and leave, the daily wage workers, and they would be pushed back from barricades by the police. Some of them would fold their hands and plead. Some of them would bribe their way. Some of them would just revolt and say, okay, arrest me if you want to, but I'm just breaking this barricade. But a lot of people would just keep walking to the city barricade and be turned back from it and then have to walk, dozens of sort of miles again to reach that barricade to be turned back again and again. And this was Seema, who was married to a scrap seller. He used to just buy what in India is called kabadi, like your waste, the newspapers that you finish reading at the end of the day, tin cans that you're, basically garbage, and repurpose it, right? So he was a scrap seller. She was married to him, and they were trying to get back to their village, and she just collapsed in tears, literally in my arms, making me step back from my old-fashioned notions of what is objectivity at this time. I'd gone to J school and I'd been taught that a journalist must have emotional distance from the story that you're telling. But in a situation like this, how is that emotional distance possible? Is it even desirable? Then we come to the story of Poonam. Now, one of the things that happened, and I'm sure Rohini and Charity's data may have done some work on this, is what are the assets that a poor person has at this time, right? So for most of India's poorest people, the one asset that they owned was a phone. So when people didn't know what to do and how to make ends meet, they sold the only thing they had, which was a phone. So when I was telling the story of these migrant workers, and I could realize that there was a class gap between my audience and the story and the class of the people I was telling. So now I had an audience that was baking banana bread on Instagram, talking about going to the Maldives, talking about the COVID blue of the sky that had suddenly been liberated from Delhi's air pollution. And I had to make this class of people care about the poorest worker at a time when, let's face it, they were also frightened, right? So how were you going to bridge this class divide? You had to come back to compelling storytelling. So I could have said, millions of migrant workers are impacted, and that would be true. But instead, I chose to tell the story of a man called Mukesh Mandal. Mukesh Mandal was a house painter. That's his photograph that his wife Poonam is holding up. And he used to do the odd job painting homes as they came up on construction sites. And like everybody else, when the lockdown happened, his work came to a grinding halt. And suddenly there was no food to feed his children. So he sold his phone, and he sold his phone for 2,000 rupees. With those 2,000 rupees, he bought a table fan for 500 rupees because it was really, really hot still in those months of Delhi. And then, or rather outskirts of Delhi, he lived in Haryana. And then he bought some wheat, he bought some lentils, he bought some grains, and he took it to his wife, who was relieved, thinking that at least this week, we won't go hungry, my children won't go hungry. But the next day, Mukesh felt a deep anxiety, and he felt that he had nothing else left to sell. He could not see any visible improvement in the future. He didn't know what to do. So he went to his wife Poonam and he asked to borrow her what we call a dupatta, the scarf. And he took the dupatta, he tied it to the bamboo pole of their one-room tenement, and he took his own life. And in my opinion, this was a starvation death. It was the fear of hunger that led him to to die. He had no visible source of income. And in the lockdown, even the distribution of free rations, which were announced by all governments, was extremely difficult because the lockdown became like a police-enforced curfew as opposed to a people-led protective measure, right? So, but the district administration that I went to meet subsequently said that he was mentally unstable. The family was made to they were illiterate, and they were made to put their thumb imprint on a set of papers to say that they didn't even understand what they were signing. And then the police could quote that piece of paper and say that he was mentally unstable. Meanwhile, the workers kept walking. You would see images like this, that they would, with folded hands, stop a truck driver, say, please let us get on. And the truck driver, in this case, said, no, the police will come after me. I can't give you a ride, not even for a few kilometers. And this went on for almost 60 days into the pandemic. You had workers walking till this case reached the Supreme Court. And, through forests, through nighttime, this became a parallel crisis to the medical crisis, where already you had beds running short and you didn't have enough doctors. And I remember one doctor telling me, I feel like I've been sent to fight a nuclear war with a lathi, with a stick. One such truck looked like this at the back. Initially, the cops wouldn't let me see what was happening, so I just had to fight with them and insist that I could get a look in. And I saw, it looked like every human trafficking movie that I'd seen. It was just these people, lumped together, desperate to get out. And I asked one of them that, aren't you scared of getting COVID? That was the basic question, right? Aren't you scared of getting COVID? And he said, well, the poverty will kill me before the virus will. And so he left. One of the things that occurred to me was when I saw these little sort of sacks being carried by women, mostly on their head, as the men carried the children. What do you carry when you leave? When you leave and you don't know if you'll make it to your destination and you don't know whether you'll come back. This was also a question that partition researchers have now looked at. What did people carry? I come from a kind of refugee family. My father's side of the family lived in undivided, when India was undivided, on the Pakistan side in Sialkot. And I grew up hearing these stories about, our family had this and our family had this, and there was a piano in the house, and there was this and there was this, and then we came with nothing. Now, of course, many people came with nothing, but even those who came with nothing and came as literally poor people they went from being wealthy to being poor overnight. Everybody carried something, one thing that meant something to them. And so as I saw these people walk, I wanted to know, what did they carry? And the answer was so moving and humbling for me. And this was their answer. They carried in a plastic bucket, so many of them that I met, their workmen's tools. And of course, they carried a couple of clothes and maybe a packet of biscuits and a blanket for their child. But they carried what in Hindi is called their auzar, their tools. And they said, maybe we'll get work on the way. Maybe there'll be somebody who'll give us work. So even through this calamity, even through this crisis, these were people who were desperate. They were not begging. They were not saying, give us a dole. They were just like, we want to work, but there is no work. And at that point, there was no sort of social security net, because they were like they were at that point an internally displaced community. So the idea that they could get to a bank account where a direct cash transfer had taken place, or through this sort of barricaded police monitoring of movement, they would even be able to access the social welfare program, was an unrealistic sort of idea. And so they carried their tools. This was somewhere in Telangana in the south. And then there was this 9-year-old child, and I playfully asked him, I said, oh, do you know what coronavirus is? By this time, some public transport had started with the intervention of the Supreme Court, and he was standing in line to take a bus back with his father to his village. And he said, of course I know what it means. And I said, what does it mean? And he said, it means I don't get food to eat. And that was a 9-year-old child's understanding. So, when we look at COVID and the pandemic as a medical story, as a story of science, as a story of doctors and drugs, it is all of those things. But for so many countries, it is also a story of power and access to resources and inequity, but it's also a story of hope and compassion and kindness, as I subsequently discovered in my story, in my journey. One of the odd things that happened in India was that there was either too much centralization or too little centralization. So sometimes you just had entire districts and it was left to the district magistrate, the local bureaucrat in the area, to take a decision. And at other times, like with the use of police, you had too much state or too little state. The overarching presence of the police was the state when you didn't need it. And outside the hospitals, when people would go from hospital to hospital, and there was not one person, either at the state level or at the central level, to tell them where to go next. And I witnessed people dying on the road at the closed doors of hospital gates. There was no state. So, when you needed the state, it went missing. When you didn't want the state, there was too much of it. Old people suffered in I'm sure for those of you who were here during the pandemic, were any of you here during the pandemic with families back home? With families back home? Okay, so you know what you would have been going through thinking about your parents or your grandparents, right? It's really strange, but of all the stories I did, this one just cut across classes and genres of viewers, because I think it spoke either to everybody's concern about their parents, or it spoke to everybody's guilt about their parents, or it spoke to everybody's fear about growing old. And this was Leelavati, who was 70 years old, and she was a widow. She had come to meet her son in Bombay, and then when the lockdown hit, the son decided that he could not look after his aging mother. He didn't have any source of income, and he was an alcoholic, so he threw her out. And because I was now following the workers, and by now trains had started running, I met her sitting outside a railway station in Bombay. And, she'd had no food, no money. And I said, "Where are you going?" She said, "I don't know. Can you put me on a train?" And I said, "But even if I put you on a train, where should I send you?" And she said, "None of my children will have me. But can you send me to Delhi? Because that's the city I know best, because I used to live there when my husband was alive." So I said, "But okay, I'll send you to Delhi, but what will you do?" And she said, "I'll beg." And I didn't know what to do. All I could do was to tell her story and hope that somebody would take notice. And that is what happened, which is that when we released this story, the railways then took her into the waiting room, they put her on a train, and a politician in Delhi actually took her in as a temporary measure till her daughter agreed to take her back. But the story of Leelavati, I have never seen, like till this date, 3 years later, somebody finds a story on Mojo Story, they write to me saying, "Can we financially help her?" And it spoke to all of our, I think, collective vulnerability. This was Jyoti. Jyoti got the attention of Ivanka Trump for all the wrong reasons, who decided to treat her trauma as a sporting achievement instead of the trauma that it was. She was a 15-year-old who cycled with her father at the back of the cycle 1,200 kilometers from Delhi to Bihar. The reason that the father couldn't ride the cycle is because he just had a knee surgery, so he couldn't pedal. The cycle was luxury, most other people were walking. And though she was feted by the world as this sort of champion, and she was given many free cycles, what was she going to do with those cycles? She kept saying, and I met her twice, and she kept saying, all I want to do is study. And that is literally my only dream. And I cried every night. We would stay at the gas stations, the petrol pumps on the highway. I was a young girl. That was a family later. It's one of the few happy endings of this story. She became such a global star that her house became the first brick house in her village, because people did offer to financially support her. There's now a movie being made on her. But again, I will say that there was a kind of romancing of this story, a romanticization of the story. No 15-year-old girl should have to cycle back home through a pandemic with her father at the back of the cycle through a lockdown. She should never have had to do that. And there was a great romanticism. I met her in her village in Bihar, and she said, "I've got 15 cycles, would you like to try one?" So we went on a cycle ride. She took me to her school, and she said, "All I want to do is study." One of the other things that we don't talk about, and I really felt strongly about this during the pandemic, is what happened to other people who were ill. They were, other illnesses did not stop. And so whether it was kidney disease, whether it was cancer, whether it was little children falling ill, needing a heart surgery, we saw this happening. We saw poor people in particular come to the sort of the gates of public health hospitals because that's all they could afford. Those hospitals were taken over and become totally COVID hospitals. And so suddenly you had, people burying their children. These were 5 girls whose father died from tuberculosis. He was a tea vendor. This was a cancer patient I met outside one of the hospitals, and he was just told by the guard, now you go to the next hospital. He's like, what's the next hospital? And no one could tell him where to go. So he was just this lonely man I just met outside one of the public health hospitals in Delhi, and he was just walking. Those are the 5 girls who lost their father to tuberculosis. Now this story, I was talking about the paradox of the police being both vulnerable, brave frontliners and also weaponized against the most vulnerable citizens. This was Manoj. He used to ride a rickshaw, an electronic rickshaw. And because there was no food, he decided that he wanted to go and buy some vegetables from the wholesale market. So he wandered outside of the permissible area that was allowed in the lockdown. And the police got hold of him, they beat him, and his arm was fractured. They beat him and they deposited him outside a hospital which wouldn't take him in. And because truth is so much more dramatic than fiction, this image to me was the most ironic image, because I found him leaning against this police barricade, beaten by the police, left by the police outside this hospital, which wouldn't take him in. And what did he do? He just went out to buy vegetables. These were workers who died in a road accident. Remember, they were taking lifts where they could, and their bodies were shoved into plastic packets and sent back home on ice slabs. The only surviving worker of this accident said that we are being treated worse than insects. Those are scenes from that accident side. And this, by the time trains were opening, it started with freight trains, goods trains that were carrying essential supplies. Tribal workers decided, they came from a very, very remote village in the heartland of India, in Madhya Pradesh. And according to me, sometimes a single image tells you the whole story of a pandemic. And the image I'm going to show you next to me is, I think, probably the most stirring image I have seen out of the pandemic. These were men and they were all men. They were walking home hundreds of kilometers like everybody else, and they decided to sleep on the rail tracks for 2 reasons. They thought there are no passenger trains, because there were no passenger trains. And 2, they thought they could hide from the police, who might send them back. But as they lay there at 4 in the morning, a goods train that was carrying supplies came and ran over them. All 18 of them died, and this is all that remained of them. A little packet of roti, a bread that they packed. It was, like I said, food was scarce. There was, even if you had money, there was no shops, no dhabas, no roadside sort of, properties that were open. And this was what remained of them. And I went to their village. It was literally on my 100th day on the road, I went to their village, and it was the toughest place to get to. I say this as someone who has covered war and riots and calamity, that it was such a remote village that it took me 18 hours by road and then another few hours on foot to get to where they came from. And nobody had thought, who were these people who died on the rail tracks? What was the name of their village? What were their names? And I met their families. And like this, we moved into the second wave. And in the second wave, we learned a lot from the first wave. We did not shut public transport. We learned that hospitals should not be converted into COVID-only hospitals, because there are people dying from other ailments that also need medical intervention. But now, this was a new mother, I beg your pardon, who just gave birth to a 1-day-old baby, and she had COVID. She had no hospital to go to. Now this became the crisis, right? Now you couldn't get a bed in hospital. You just couldn't get a bed in hospital. And if you could get a bed in hospital, you couldn't get oxygen. And I met people who were made to sign what I have called modern-day death warrants, because they were just made to sign waivers saying, and it isn't the hospital's fault, frankly, because they didn't have the oxygen. They were made to sign warrants saying that if your loved one dies from a shortage of oxygen, you will not sue the hospital, right? I saw something I never thought I would see in my life. Gurdwaras, which are Sikh places of worship, normally have what's called a langar, which is a free meal for the very poor, right? halwa, dal. I mean, some of you would be familiar with the langar. Gurdwaras in India started oxygen langars. Now, this is also about the hope and the compassion that one saw. Where governments were missing, people stepped in. Social media for once became a mechanism for good. People would say, do you know someone who can supply oxygen? Do you know someone who can give me so-and-so supply? And Gurdwaras started what was called oxygen langars. And you would see scenes like this where there would be giant oxygen cylinders placed on the road. Somebody could drive in or come on a rickshaw, poor, rich, it didn't matter. You were allowed to have access to a single oxygen cylinder for half an hour, then you had to move on and make room for the next person. It was like the McDonald's of oxygen. It was like a drive-through. And it feels almost like weird now for me to say it like this, but this is what it was. It was a drive-through oxygen langar. In the meantime, people started taking cardboard strips. I actually met a family that slept on cardboard strips on the floor of, this was a Bombay hospital. These were the images from our cremation grounds, our graveyards, our hospitals, just absolute devastation. And now we come to this image, which became a major fault line in India's internal discussions. How many people have died from COVID? We started this conversation by saying that numbers didn't tell the full story. You needed to know the people behind the numbers. The unfortunate dimension to this is we don't even know the numbers, right? The epidemiologists all vary in their estimation. The World Health Organization says 10 times more people have died in India than the official count. In the middle of all of this, I remember this day well. It was one day before my father died. My father died from COVID. And it was very strange for me. We were in the second wave by now. This had been my whole life. And I literally became the story I had been reporting. Obviously, albeit with all the caveats that I came from privilege. When my father couldn't get a hospital bed, I was able to call a doctor. I was able to say, please get him a hospital bed. The doctor agreed, but the hospital was an hour away. And there was no ambulance available at that time, and I made a mistake that continues to haunt me, that my sister and I got what was called a private agency, and they said, it's a private ambulance. But when this so-called ambulance arrived, it was a broken down van, like a really old ramshackle van. It had a hard bench at the back. It had a kind of rusty giant oxygen cylinder lying on the floor, and he didn't even have a mask. There was only a driver, there were no paramedics. And I had to make a split-second decision. Do I send this guy away? Do I just wait for the hospital, ambulance? And I made the decision to jump on the front seat and go with my father, all the while driving through a snarl of traffic that had again been created by police barricades who were trying to enforce a lockdown. Anyway, there was a whole mile long of other daughters possibly in ambulances with their fathers, and here we go to this hospital. And by the time we reached the hospital, my father was supposed to be admitted to a general room, and the doctors on emergency duty, they checked his oxygen and they found that the cylinder hadn't worked as it was meant to. So his oxygen levels had plummeted and he had to be admitted to an ICU. There was no ICU bed. And literally I had spent a year and a half telling this story about other people. People outside hospitals, people not able to get a bed, people desperate. I now became that desperate person. Please, I need an ICU bed. We got the ICU bed, but it was the last time that I saw him alive. And 5 days later, when he died, we had to cremate him near the hospital because the hospital was technically in another state and it would have needed police permission to bring him back home. So we couldn't bring him back home. And at the cremation ground, there was no space to cremate him. So we actually had to call the police to say that, can you please help us cremate our father? And that evening, I tested positive for COVID. So it was very surreal. But I remember this image because it was the evening before I took my father to hospital. And it was a cremation ground where this was the image. And you knew, and the caretaker at the cremation ground told me that the official number from the city that week had been 30, but he'd handled 300 bodies in a day. And so it became my kind of mission after I got better. It was also the only way I knew how to deal with loss and grief, that I was going to chase the story of the uncounted COVID deaths, because I felt that, we had criticized the media ourselves saying people can't just be numbers, and now we were saying they weren't even numbers. But when we had these images, and some of us did, we were called vultures by trolls who said that we were feasting off the dead, and we were sort of, why were we showing these images? And look at the American press, because, it never does a story on mass graves. This is not true. I personally pulled out several stories from the front pages of the Post and the New York Times that had actually done similar stories on uncounted COVID deaths here in the United States of America. So it's not that this did not happen here. But then this was another cremation ground where literally bodies were lying on the floor like this because there was just no place to actually cremate them. This is drone footage of the banks of the Ganga. So before I show you the next few visuals, I just want you to understand what was happening. Remember, we spoke in the beginning of invisibilization by the media, of a number of things that were happening. By the time the second wave happened, if in the first wave the daily wage workers had been invisibilized, by the second wave, rural India did not figure in COVID reporting. It just didn't figure in COVID reporting. Now, what was happening in the villages of India is that people were not testing. Either they were not testing because there was stigma, or they were not testing because there was no access to testing, or if they were testing, they didn't know what to do next because hospitals weren't close by enough to access. So what started happening is that if you would go to villages, you would find that the panchayat would tell you, the local sort of village governance module would tell you, that in these last 2 months, we have seen a surge in the number of people dying from fever and, khansi zukam, as it's called, cough and cold, and breathlessness, which were, of course, symptoms of this respiratory disorder that we understood COVID to be. But had they been tested? No. And because they hadn't been tested, they would never be counted among the dead. And because rural India was completely invisibilized, nobody was documenting these. So you were not counted if you died at home. You were not counted if you did not get an RT-PCR test. I have met people who spent their days, in an ambulance trying to get tested and couldn't get tested, and then died in the ambulance. That would not be counted as a COVID death. And you were not counted as dead if you died from a shortage of oxygen, which scores of people did as oxygen just ran out in the ICUs. And if your death certificate did not list COVID as the cause of death, and there were states where the local administration was instructed that you don't get into the cause of death, let the hospital decide. The hospital would say, oh, oxygen ran short, but I'm not going to give that as a cause of death. Cause of death was cardiac disorder, right? So through the cracks of officialdom, the way the system was set up, the fact that many people couldn't get a death certificate, the fact that the cause of death became something that the administration and private hospitals started palming off to one another. And again, remember, if you think of Mukesh Mandal, who had sold his phone, now you had abjectly poor people who sold, again, everything they owned, maybe a piece of jewelry, maybe a piece of land, in the belief that a private hospital would save lives. They thought, okay, public health system is totally overridden. Maybe the private hospitals will, and then in so many of these private hospitals, the oxygen ran short. In the meantime, there were some families that were so poor that they did not even have wood to burn the dead. So for a combination of these reasons, we started seeing this very tragic phenomena in North India, in parts of North India, where bodies were thrown into rivers or left on the riverbanks in the dead of night with just what is called the Ramnami cloth, which is a sacred cloth for Hindus. And this is the kind of scene that you would see, as you travel down the banks of the river. But this became a really, really politicized conversation. And by 2021, I started to feel a kind of fury at everything I was seeing. And, I'm a political junkie. I live for elections. I live to cover elections. But at that time, it seemed to me to be so, immoral and egregious that elections were being held while this is what I was finding on the banks, that elections were being held while schools were closed, right? That government employees who were teachers in government schools were forcibly sent on election duty for local elections. And more than 1,000 of them died from COVID. These were all lower income families who were employed. A pregnant woman was among them. So I was, for the first time in my democracy that I'm otherwise proud of, I was really offended by the fact that these elections were being held. And I decided to not cover the elections. Maybe it made a difference to nobody, but I at my level, boycotted, and I don't really believe in boycotts, but I was like, I'm not going to cover these elections. These elections shouldn't be held. So there was again in this media disconnect, because by now, the media had just turned away from all of this and was back on the elections. And the elections were the headlines. These were not the headlines, right? And this is what was happening on the banks of our river. Many of these places were not reachable by a road. You had to get onto a motorcycle, you had to walk, you had to take a boat, down the Ganga. And finally, we said in the beginning that every existing inequity was exacerbated by COVID. Among the things I discovered was what happened to caste groups whose traditional occupation was to wash the bodies of the dead. And these caste groups existed even within Muslims. So this was Hyderabad, where I met a man who said, I'm a body washer. That was his professional occupation. He actually had an ID card that said this, and nobody was willing to come near these families. And in Varanasi, where Hindus, among Hindus, Dalits, traditionally washed the body and were washing COVID bodies before they were taken to the pyre. I remember what one of them said, and this happened in front of me. I was walking with him in front of a cremation ground, and there was a shopkeeper, and he said, get away from here. He said to this young man who's washing everybody's bodies before they were lit, and he said, look at this, we are doing what families want, but we are still treated like this, and now doubly so because we are washing the bodies of the COVID dead. So I guess in effect, there were things, of course, that were uplifting. They were for the poison that we saw on television channels. I met community groups where Hindus and Muslims buried and cremated each other's each other's dead. I met a man called Abdul Malbari in Surat in Gujarat, where he had one ambulance, and the ambulance said funerals for lonely humans, and his one purpose in life was to go and, according to your faith, perform the last rite. So in his sort of closet-sized, his closet-sized office, he had Ganga Jal, which is the sacred water of the river Ganga, but he also had namaz mats. In the housing societies of Surat, I met women who were homemakers who said, we don't know how to help, but maybe we can cook 5 more rotis than we do, and every day we'll cook these rotis. We saw people rally together and behind each other help perfect strangers. And when we finally got our act together in terms of getting the vaccines out, as I said in the beginning, we did well. We had very minimal vaccine hesitancy compared to the kind of politics you see around it here. Once we learned from our mistakes, we learned. But by then, so many people had paid a very, very costly price. And I think, I'll just end by saying, I know it's difficult to remember COVID. I know that people don't want to remember it. But again, I'll draw a parallel with partition, where, Ashish Nandi, who's one of India's best-known sociologists, he did this project called Memory and Partition. And one of the things he argued was that whenever something cataclysmic happens in the life of a people or in the life of a nation, like the partition of India, the instinct is to put a lid on it and to bury the memory. And the moment you bury a memory, there is a kind of schizophrenia that develops, that has developed as we see between India and Pakistan. And COVID is something similar. I think we are desperate to forget. I can understand that. I lived nothing else for two years plus. I get the whole need to move on, but I think if we don't pause to think, okay, what did it teach us about ourselves? What did it teach us about our relationships? What did it teach us about society, about the organization of power, about, access to resources? What should policy be going forward? Why aren't these things that people vote on? The quality of air, the quality of healthcare. There's so much to think about here, and for me personally, I call reporting the Kargil war in 99 my first masterclass in life. I was 26 and a half. I covered COVID in my 40s, and it really literally was the second masterclass in life. It made me re-examine every assumption of what I understood to be the role of a journalist, what I understood to be my role, what I understood to be the hierarchy of news, what I understood about TV channels, about the people of India. And I think those discussions continue. Many things don't have certitude. But as long as one can at least begin asking the questions, now with the benefit of some distance, I think that will be the lesson we need to take away. Otherwise, it may not be COVID, it'll be something else tomorrow, and our fault lines will be wrenched open once again. So I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barkha. That was all-absorbing and also heart-wrenching, and I think I speak for everyone, we're sorry for your loss as well of your father through all this. But thank you for sharing that and for taking that journey over those 2 years as well. I think you did a huge service for all of us to really understand what has happened. I'm going to turn right now, and I hope that this works if I just move ahead with the slides. Yes. To some research insights. So I'm going to try to put some data to some of the faces that you showed us. And I want to turn to the issue of gender. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask 2 questions. And then I think we can open it up for the audience and the people online as well, so we make sure we can have time with them. So in July, when we were together, we talked a little bit about some of the surveys that we've conducted through inclusion economics. So that's, let me come a little closer, thanks. That's, with Rohini here, Jenna Allard, who's in the audience, myself, Yusuf Neger, Simone Shaner, and then Malik Jagani here with other universities. So when COVID hit, we decided, what can we do? I think, like many people, we were thinking, what can we do to help, right? And what we knew we could do is we can collect data and at least try to document and then share information about the migrants in particular, but just anyone that we could collect data on to understand what was happening through this crisis. And we worked with government partners, and they said, we don't really understand what's happening, so please do help us. Help us understand in particular these migrants that are leaving cities. And so the migrants, as they were returning back to their home states, they were intercepted, and people would collect their details, and then we use that information to call these individuals. And ultimately what we did is we went back to a core group of migrants about 4 different times to understand how well they were doing through the pandemic. So just to kind of show you, we surveyed them over a 15-month period. We reached out to them 4 different times and had 1,780 individuals that returned to Bihar and Chhattisgarh. To just understand what had happened to them. And what came out from this in particular was a real gender gap and gender disparities in terms of being able to return to life as usual, particularly for those who had worked prior to the pandemic. So I'm going to focus in on the group of migrants who are already working. So these were, many women in India don't work, of course, outside the home, but we're only focusing on men and women who worked prior to the pandemic. And what I'll show you is, we have information, sorry, it's going to be hard for you to see here, but at the beginning of the pandemic, we're looking at all women who were working. About 4 in 5 were working in some sort of unskilled labor, and we surveyed them through what we called recovery phase 1 and phase 2, and then in COVID phase 2. And what we saw is that these women ended up going from skilled labor often into unskilled labor, or more commonly agricultural jobs, or just dropping out of the labor force entirely. And that persisted all the way through the end of the second phase of COVID, where half of the women that we spoke with who had previously been employed in urban areas, they were no longer employed. Many of these women were stuck back at home in the villages and could not actually return. If we compare it to the figure for men, what we see here is about half of the men were in skilled labor, and then as the pandemic hit, again, agriculture absorbed lots of migrants and was able to help them, especially through that first wave. And by the end and by the second wave, about a third of the men were unemployed, even during this downturn, but it didn't really compare well to what was going on for women. And as I mentioned, sorry, this is probably too much information on one slide, but essentially women were stuck in rural areas. The ones that were remaining in rural areas had a much more difficult time actually finding work in particular. And this was 15 months after the pandemic began. And that's what we see. We also see that women, failed to recover their earnings. Even prior to the pandemic, of course, they were earning less money than men on average. But if we look at what happened to them, sorry for the blurriness at the bottom, I'm not sure why that is. If we look at, their recovery, essentially men were able to recover, very close to the level that they earned prior to the pandemic. But these women, again, were not able to do that. And then finally, these women too, particularly the ones that were kind of stuck in rural areas, 15 months after the pandemic began, were reporting that they were likely to reduce consumption, and more so than kind of other men and those who had gone into urban areas as well. So all that to say, just wanted to show you some of what we had gathered, and I'd love to hear your perspective in particular on what happened to women through the pandemic and what you saw through that gender lens.
Yeah, I think that, as we said, every inequity was amplified. And that is what happened to women as well. And what I remember is during the pandemic, pregnant women really struggling to get access to any healthcare. That is my first memory of COVID. Like you actually had to have doctors go into slums or do these virtual calls, and you would meet these pregnant women on the streets, when we spoke about the other people who needed healthcare. So that is my first memory, think of all these pregnant women. Secondly, in India, at least, I don't know how it was here, pregnant women got access to vaccines last. There was the debate just carried on over whether it was safe, not safe. And finally, it was like a group of sort of doctors that led the demand and said that this must happen. But what happened inside homes is in fact very, very distressing. We had a distinct spike in the reported cases of domestic abuse. We don't even know right now what the unreported cases may have been like. The government-run child helpline was deluged with calls from children and girls mostly saying that we're being forced into underage marriage. I went to investigate one of these trends, and I ended up in a village in Rajasthan where I basically found that what was happening was that because we had among the longest physical school lockdowns in the world, in a vast number of girls were just out of the classroom. If a family had one internet device, then if there was a boy, it was given to the boy. And so you had all of these girls who had nothing to do. And then their families would tell them that since you're doing nothing, you should go and get married. And one of the saddest things I ever heard was one of the activists who was working with these girls told me that in some cases, it's the mothers who are pushing for these girls to go to the so-called infant husband's village, because with the man at home, if he turned abusive or violent, or in some cases forced sex on his partner. And remember, these are homes we're talking about in very enclosed, tiny spaces. The mothers didn't think their daughters were safe at home. And they actually thought that the daughters may be safer. So some did it because, oh, what are you doing? Go get married. Some did it because they thought that they were actually creating distance between their girls in an abusive house. Of course, like with everything else in India, these girls answered it by forming a football team. It was just an incredible story. They formed a football team, and every time the village elders would say, what are you doing? They'd say, we play football. And then they actually became state level football players. But not every village had that kind of sort of happy ending. And let's not pretend that this happened only to the poor. We had, I think, if I'm not wrong, please, you guys are the experts. At some point, I think the female labor force participation number hit 9% at one point in the pandemic. And basically what was happening was that even in the PLU class, people like us, with partners at home, with children at home, this work from home today sounds like a concept which is meant to make your life easier. But if you're a woman in India and there is no equality at home, there's no degendering of the workspace, of the home space, I beg your pardon, of the roles at home, of whose job it is to put the food on the table, and whose job it is to get the children dressed, and whose job it is to also do your job, right? That burden fell inordinately on women. And women just stopped working. Women just said, we can't do this. So everything from vaccine access to access to healthcare for pregnant women, to domestic violence, to underage marriages, to having to leave your work. This was a very, very, very gendered experience. And the other thing is that women, at least in our cultural context, are so conditioned to be all sacrificing. There is so much romance around the sacrificing woman that you don't hear a lot of these stories till you go out to seek them. The women don't come forth to complain because they have, over decades of cultural conditioning, internalized that if there's one roti in the house, my child and my husband will eat it first. So I haven't even begun to get into sort of the malnourishment data or the maternal mortality data that would have emerged in these years. But anecdotally, this is what I saw happening. I saw women leaving work in educated upper middle class homes. And literally, I mean, I know women where I literally was like, don't do it. You'll regret it. It'll be tough to get back. We just can't take the anxiety of it. So at every layer, you saw women experiencing the pandemic in a very, very different way.
Yeah, definitely resonates. Okay, so I have one last question for you. Thank you for that. And then we can open it up to the audience and people online too. And that is, referenced, I think we're probably the group of people that if we were in India, we were baking banana bread and maybe sending some money to someone, or in the US, making sourdough bread or whatever it was. You told this story about this young boy. What does Corona, mean? What is Corona? It means that I'm hungry. So, COVID's not the last shock we're all going to face. And I think, you said you want us to learn from this. So just practically speaking, what can we do? How can we help, consider those that are, completely invisibilized and marginalized in the day-to-day?
Yeah. I mean, to be completely honest, if I weren't a journalist, I would have also been at home doing the same. I come from the same class. I come from privilege. So, I may self-identify as middle class, but that is more a cultural value than an economic condition. And so I don't want to be, I wasn't meaning to be holier than thou or being judgy. I was just saying that was the fact of life, that upper middle class Indians were distraught with anxiety and they were dealing with it by entertaining themselves with all kinds of new sort of cooking skills or whatever. And I would have done the same had I been sitting at home and not been among the people. I basically think we have to ask more of our political class and our media. As people on this side, you have to ask more of it. You see, right now, what really scares me is that there is a growing disconnect between people in politics and people in media. And I think a lot of people, like I think Reuters had this study where they spoke about this new genre of people who are news avoiders. Basically, like growing number of people now feel there's no point my engaging with journalism because firstly, it's all bad news. I don't want to feel bad, or I don't want to be triggered. Or what can I do about it anyway? So you know what? It's just better that I don't know it. And I have friends like this, dear friends, who at the end of like a day from hell, I'll go back and say, don't you know this happened? And they'll be like, what? And in some ways, I'm grateful for them because they keep me real and there's another dimension to my life. But the other level, it's instructive to me that there is just such a gap that nobody today actually feels that what the media shows you is something that impacts you. The media is just something other people do. It's just something that journalists do. How does it impact your life, right? So I think till we start asking more of our journalists and more of our governments everywhere in the world, I mean, it really bothers me. As a person who lives in Delhi, who has become asthmatic in her 40s, that I live in a city where people don't vote on the basis of what the quality of air is. That we as women don't vote on the basis of, who might have a policy that is more sort of forward thinking when it comes to women, right? And of course, people are many things. We're not just women or citizens of Delhi or we're many different things. And politics, elections are won and lost on a multiple set of issues. But what can we do is I think the biggest thing we can do is to not disengage. I just fear that there is such a disengagement. It is so deep between people in politics and people in media that I really believe that the next calamity, and there will be a next calamity, I mean, would we have globally learned anything from it? I remember I was looking at the US from Delhi, and I was like, how can you not have how can there be such tolerance for anti-vaxxers? How self-indulgent is it that people are dying in my country because they can't get access to vaccines in the first stage when the government hadn't purchased enough, and there are vaccines just going waste in other parts of the world, right? But who's engaged? Who's making a noise? And the second thing is, and I really believe this as a storyteller, that you have to have a way to communicate outside of your echo chamber. There is no purpose in my saying this to people who already think like me. So then what have we achieved? Right. And if it takes some, academic to get onto TikTok, if it takes me to learn how to do a 30-second video instead of a 40-minute talk, I have to learn how to do it. We just have to get off our preachy little high horses and figure out a language that actually speaks to people who are outside of how we think. And I think the collapse of conversation across differences of opinion in America, in India, this is costly to framing policy, because policy is for all. Policy exists irrespective of which party you vote. And therefore, there has to be some way of finding consensus on policy. And with the polarization in media, in politics, I really worry about finding that consensus for policy.
Yeah, likewise. I definitely think that's an issue here. I know people have, I don't know if there's researchers, some story was even just hearing about family conversations, it's, we've even curtailed those and we self-censor, I think, a lot, and also disengage. Shall we go ahead with some questions from the audience, or Zara, I'll let you kind of lead where we start. So does anyone here have questions? I think if you do, go ahead and raise your hand, and we've got a few, I think, from the audience online as well.
Thank you, first of all, for your time for coming here. I follow you, your channel on YouTube and also on Facebook. So talking about holding politicians accountable, I wholeheartedly agree with you on this. So I grew up in Calcutta, and I am very much in touch with everything that's going on in India, especially in Bengal. So I begin my day with NDTV and CNN, and I can, confirm that it's not the ideal way to start my day because it makes me angry. So last week I called, while I was watching the Indian news, I called the ABP network, Calcutta based, because a politician who I know, had very humble beginnings and really became uber wealthy in a few years, as it happens. And he had an eye issue that was bothering him. And like all politicians, India wasn't good enough. So he flew to Johns Hopkins to get his eye tested. And apparently he's also going to be back for a follow-up appointment. And I can barely make it to New York City for my follow-up appointments. I asked the person who took the call, I said, my complaint is not to you, not directed at you, but can you please ask your journalists to raise this question that when the public health infrastructure is barely existent, how on earth do these people shamelessly fly all the way to the US for an eye exam? And why aren't the journalists asking these questions? And his answer was, ma'am, their hands are tied. And that is my request to you. First of all, thank you for choosing independent journalism. I think it is very, very important to keep democracy alive. And if you can address this issue when you go back and, just bring some awareness around this, that.
No, thank you. And I'll follow this up, but it's kind of similar to, in India, we're having this whole debate around language. I don't know how many of you have been following it. And a recent sort of parliamentary panel recommended that, and parts of it I support, an emphasis on regional languages, on the fact that people should know Hindi, and also if you're in Tamil Nadu, Tamil, and just whatever your own language is. But the operative part of it is this attempt to remove the primacy of English because it's a colonial language. And I just think that if we were to just pull out, how many of our political class send their children to English medium schools, I think the hypocrisy of that would be evident to see. So I think it's similar. I think those who can get treatment outside of India in politics, in society, even in media would. And there's definitely a story if it's being done on taxpayers' money, but otherwise it's a story of doublespeak, right? Where you encourage the poor to say you must get treated at home, but you fly abroad yourself. But again, you follow the news. But I'm telling you, the real crisis is, one, people don't follow the news. Two, when they follow the news, they only follow the news that they already agree with. So they never think that there's a reality outside of the news they follow. And they're so shocked and so judgmental when they see that news, but that's your fellow citizens who think differently. And I think the real crisis is, for me, is that if you can't create a consensus on certain basic universal values in public policy, in public health policy, in, a bureaucrat is meant to execute, like the migrant workers, it shouldn't matter whether you vote BJP, Congress, Trinamool, TRS, it shouldn't matter. It cannot matter at this time. And that the fate that ideological battles today obstruct partnerships in policy making is something that deeply concerns me. Because honestly, people who work in this space have to work with all governments. They can't afford to bring their political leanings to being public policy or public health experts. A doctor who heads All India Medical Institute is not going to say, I vote this way, so I will now not, you know what I mean? So
when we talk about news consumption, I mean, I will follow up what you've told me, but I will briefly also say that please do engage with news outside of the news that you already agree with. And it's important. Honestly, it's important. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I think there's a couple of questions here. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Barkha, for coming.
Thank you.
Here and talking. I just had a question. You touched upon education a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
You touched about the pandemic, like education during pandemic, and how education was one of the last things that were opened up in India, when US and UK probably did it like 6 or 7 months before. So as you were traveling, particularly in 2021, did you see people on the ground talking about it? Did you see any concerns about educational institutes being closed, and particularly with the dearth of mobile phones or laptops so that they can attend virtual classes? What did you see on the ground about that?
Oh, I saw in particular in lower income groups, people desperate for schools to reopen. Desperate. Like there was a kind of desperation. And the one thing that actually there was a kind of class unison on was please open schools. Obviously, for the poor, as I said, with the child marriages and so on, the costs were different. But I think you now have enough data on the fact that children's cognitive skills, social skills, emotional skills, learning skills, all of them have been really sort of egregiously hit in the last 2 years. The other thing I saw was poorer families were really dipping into savings to pay the fees of private schools. And those fees didn't automatically stop. So what was really happening was this big crisis where incomes had halted, but the school fees still had to be paid, otherwise you would lose your spot in the school. And among the more, it just came to me that one of the most tragic stories I reported was a young girl who was the daughter of an auto rickshaw driver from Hyderabad, and he had put together everything he had, sold the only piece of land. He had 2 daughters, and he couldn't afford to educate them both. So he had to take this decision that I will invest my savings in the one who seems to show more scholarly promise. So he managed to get her into Lady Shri Ram College, which is a premier college in Delhi. And when it was announced that classes had to go online, she was so distraught because she didn't have a laptop, and she took her own life. And so, you know, I think we underestimate what education means, especially to those. I mean, I know that there were kids who had to be pulled out of school because their parents had lost their job and they suddenly couldn't afford, you know, to pay the fees. Fees was a major issue. So this is again an example of a disconnect. This is what people cared about, but this was not on the media. It was just not on the media. And everywhere people would be like, can you please, like, we're just desperate. For women who wanted to go back to work, to those hours in the day where your children went to school, was also about your space to do something. Or for poorer families, the absence of a midday meal scheme, a hot one-cooked meal. So we have to join the dots between all of these things. So I picked up a lot of this, but it was unmovable. You could not move policy across government. You could not. And by the way, in many cases, parents of privileged classes, some were very in favor of opening, some were very opposed to it. And in the absence of that consensus, means no schools open.
Okay, we have an online question, and this may be our last question because we're shorter on time. So the question is, can you comment on the similarities and differences between covering COVID and covering war?
Oh, that's a great question. And I actually, if I had to bookend my life, not that I plan to retire, but if I had to bookend my life in journalism, it would be from Kargil to COVID. Both were the toughest stories I've ever reported. Both transformed me personally. When I went to cover war, I had to really fight as a woman to be allowed to the war front. There were no mobile phones at that time. There was no broadcast living capacity to broadcast live. We would still film on tape. We would walk kilometers in the mountains to find chopper pilots who could take our tapes back. It was obviously life and death, very risky. And yet again, my attempt there was to humanize and understand the psychology of the Indian soldier, who was really 24, 25 years old. And I wanted to understand what a young man, they were all men then, infantry continues to be all men, even today, what a young man thinks when he's walking into possible death. how does courage and vulnerability coexist? So it was kind of very transforming for me personally, and among the toughest, scariest, riskiest stories I had ever done till it came to COVID, where too there was so much unknown. And in Kargil, at least you knew that there were Pakistani intruders sitting on the Indian mountain peaks, and they were going to bomb you, and you had to hide when the bomb came, and you had to take cover. And I didn't always know what to do. I was very young, but I learned certain things. I had a female producer with me when we were traveling across India for COVID, and I don't notice, because I've done this for so long, that there are no bathrooms for women along the way. Like I'm just picking up something small where we're talking about the gendered experience of reporting. So men can take a leak wherever they want to, but there's nothing. And she was just mortified. And because I had been trained in this, I had done this in Kargil. There were no clothes, there were no bathrooms, there was no food. So in a way, I had been prepared for this moment, possibly because I had reported war. But this was longer than war. This was just longer. And it reminds me, actually, I'll end with that story. It reminds me of a nurse that I met in a hospital in Bombay. And, on 26/11, which was India's 9/11, when terrorists came into Bombay, the city of Bombay, and there was a 3-day siege, 2 of them entered this hospital in Bombay. And this nurse had been on neonatal duty. So she was on duty in a ward where there were all these new mothers and their babies. And when these terrorists came in with their assault rifles, she switched off all the lights, and she had the presence of mind to take away all the phones and turn them off, and somehow managed to save lives. And then she was on COVID duty. And I remember meeting her, and I said, which is tougher? And she said, look, there are apples and oranges, but this is so long, I think it'll never end. At least that night ended, right? And I think for me, both are the most meaningful work that I've done. Both are the scariest work I've done. Both have transformed me personally at different stages in my life. But both teach you the same lesson. What is the job of a journalist? The job of a journalist is to go to a place that your audience cannot access, to ask the questions that your audience wants to know, but may have nobody asking, but also to ask the questions that nobody else is asking. And you have to do all three and be that bridge. And therefore, the lesson from both stories is the same. That is my role as a reporter. Thank you.
Thank you, Barkha. That was an amazing hour and a bit, and I'd invite everyone to come outside and join us to talk to Barkha in a more informal setting now.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you to everyone online. Thank you.